In this video, I want to cover some techniques that I recommend for simplifying your Android app and ideally making it a one or two screen application. I'm going to talk about several concepts that you might not be familiar with if you're new to Android programming, but that's okay. As a matter of fact, it's best that you watch this video first so that you can plan your app in the most efficient way possible. Reason being, every screen on your app is more work for you. So if we plan to minimize the screens in advance, we're minimizing the work that we need to do to make a high quality app and get it live as soon as possible. So why do we like simple applications with few screens? First of all, simple is good. The more screens we have, the more clicks we have, and the more clicks we have, the more complicated our app is to our users. Think about an app that you use that requires a lot of clicks. And then think about an app that you use that requires few clicks. The best case example that I often think of is Shazam, because you open the app, you press anywhere, it tells you what's playing. And admit it, you might even do this when you're driving, which you shouldn't do, but simple is better. You don't want to go through a logon screen and a menu screen. You want to open, press anywhere, get information, and then that completes your journey. Another thing is a rule my father always told me about grammar, and that is economy of words. Do as much as you can or say as much as you can in as few words possible. And finally, we know that mobile devices tend to have limited screens and limited resources. So we want our application to reflect that and not try a desktop or a full-blown web application when we have the resources and the screen real estate of just a mobile application. When I teach Android programming, typically the first thing I do is ask all of the groups to put together a storyboard of what their app is going to look like. And this is so that I can help the group make the most of their time as they're working on this project. What I look for is the storyboard, and I look for something like what you see on the screen right now versus something that shows one or two screens. If I see something like this, it's too complicated, and there are a lot of things that we can cut out to make this easier. So I'm going to use this as a point of reference to show one way to do it, complicated with a lot of screens, versus another way to do it, simple with fewer screens. So this is just an example. We don't really need to pay attention to all the details, but you do see a splash screen with an enter button, a main menu screen, a whole logon series, and about us. And then one thing that's kind of interesting, a search screen, a results screen, and then a place to enter a new item, and then a confirmation screen. So several different flows that we could consider about how to simplify. I have several quick tips on how to simplify your application and reduce the screen count. I have a demo application here called My Plant Diary. I initially used this application in my classroom instruction to show several features of Android in the Kotlin programming language. Since then, I've added some more features, and I've also polished it up a little bit, and I'm soon going to release this application on the Play Store, so it will be a real live application. Nonetheless, it's a great way to demonstrate some of these concepts, and so I'll walk through these one at a time and show how they can be used in the application. Let's start with combined search bar and search results. And again, that's this flow down here where we have an enter search screen, then we see results, could add new, do a save confirmation, something like that. Well, it's a lot easier if we combine the search page and the search results all on one page. I want to demonstrate this with this very first screen, but first I want to explain a little bit about the data relationships that we'll see here in My Plant Diary, because that will help to understand why we need search and results. So if we look at My Plant Diary, the user is essentially entering a new specimen, where a specimen is a specific plant at a specific location, like the redbud tree in your front yard, for instance. And then from a specimen, we can have many events, like planting it, watering it, fertilizing it, or maybe gathering fruit from it. And the events can have one or more photos. So you see we have a one-to-many relationship going from specimen to photos. But if we take a look to the left, we also see a one-to-many relationship from plant to specimen. And by that we mean the scientific definition of a plant. So a genus, species, and cultivar. I'm pulling that in from a JSON feed that you see right here that has plant names and a few attributes of the plant. And every specimen is going to have essentially a foreign key back to the unique identifier inside of this JSON feed, which you can see over here to the left. On the screen that you're looking at, we can enter plants and associate those with specimens, and we can even add some events from this screen. But let's just start with associating a plant or a genus species cultivar with a specimen. We start with this autocomplete field here, and I can say something like Eastern, and you notice it autocompletes, and it's autocompleting from that JSON data that I provided earlier. So Eastern Redbud, and I simply click that, and you see with this, we've associated a plant on the one side to the specimen that we're creating on the mini side, and we've done it all in one screen. Now, a corollary to that, use dialogs instead of new screens. So the plant database that I have here has about 6,000 plants, but that's not necessarily all plants. For example, you might see Fuji apple just like so. But do you see Gala apple? Well, no Gala apple simply because I have not entered that yet. So what if I want the user to be able to create a new plant definition that doesn't exist? Once again, traditionally, we might think of a new screen where we just enter plant definitions, but we can get a little bit crafty on this screen here. I type in Gala apple, and then by using a focus change listener, I can determine that that Gala apple, or in other words, that plant, does not exist in the list of predefined plants. So as soon as I tab off of that field, you'll notice that a dialog box comes up, and it prompts me to create a new plant record. Malus domestica. You notice it actually autocompletes on the genus because Malus is the genus for apple. And then domestica, once again, it will autocomplete on that. For an apple that you eat, the species is typically domestica. And then the cultivar is the name that you see in the grocery store. So Gala apple, Red Delicious apple, Fuji apple, Honeycrisp, all of those are what we're going to call the cultivar. Full sun and need watering, and then I'm going to choose save. But notice that behind me here, we still have that main screen up. This is just a dialog, so we haven't actually left the screen. And this dialog comes up automatically only when needed. I choose save. Next, outsource your login. There are many providers who can do this for you. Firebase Auth is one, and it's one that I find is easy to integrate to the mobile app. So remember where we are here, we're going to have a login screen, and many times I'll see someone who wants to create their own login screen. I strongly advise against that, because I've seen many projects where they spend 15 weeks and they never get beyond the login screen. Outsource your login screen, and that way you can focus on your core competency. Let's take a look up here. If I choose log on, log off, it's going to give me a prompt again with a dialog, a confirmation, but here you see we haven't actually left the screen. So I choose yes. Now I can go back, and at this point it doesn't know who I am because I've logged off, and we can confirm that because if I hit the specimen dropdown, I don't see my specimens that I have created that are associated with my ID. So I'm going to come back here and choose log on. What you'll see is that it's redirecting me to another experience, and this is an experience that's provided to me by Firebase Auth, just by me integrating with Firebase Authentication. Another neat thing is that on the mobile device, you essentially stay logged in unless it forces you to log out. So you see, it already knows who I am because I'm logged into the simulator, so I simply press that button, I'm logged in, and now let's take a look if I have specimens in the dropdown. And sure enough, you see when I click the dropdown, several specimens that I've entered previously. Let's go ahead and pick one. Embed action buttons on recycler views. So recall our entity relationship dialog. A plant is a scientific definition of a plant, something you'd see in an encyclopedia. A specimen is something you'd plant in your own yard, and then that can be associated with events and with photos. You see here for the Bracken's Brown Beauty, Southern Magnolia, it's on Checkers Island, and the description is lovely. Now down here we have a series of events, and many times these can have photos associated with them. Instead of having to click on this item and then go to a different screen and delete, I simply used what's called a recycler view in Android, and I put the delete button right next to each item. So if I want to delete it, I press the delete button, click yes, and it's gone. This is a bit more pronounced if you see something that has a photo attached. Let's take a look at lobster claw, and you notice that this one's a little easier to imagine just because you can see that you can scroll through this recycler and you can see the events and the photos. So you see on one screen, we've represented every single one of these relationships. Now, once again, if I go up towards the top and I click the delete button, or really just choose the delete button on any of these, it's going to remove both the event and the associated photo, and then it simply leaves the events and the photos that are remaining. All of this, again, on the same screen. Use menu and ifRoom to show other navigation. So we want to be careful about not cluttering up our screens. And you notice that up at the top here, I have a couple icons that are easily recognized. The home button takes us right back to here. Then I have a map button, and that map button will take us to a map view that will show us a GPS view of all of the specimens that we have GPSed. And I can always go back home just by clicking on the home button. We see over here we have something called overflow. You see reminders and log on, log off. That's anything that did not fit on this bar across the top. Those are things that are kind of a different priority. The things that we always want to show should be very high priority, like how to get to home. Because you're going to hit that a lot more frequently than you're going to hit log on, log off. As a matter of fact, once you log on, you may never log off again. And so having a button that would show log off on every single screen would be a waste because it's something that you're not likely to do. The reality is users have been trained over the life of mobile applications to go to the upper right and look for a log on, log off. So that doesn't need to be a special widget, nor does it need to be an entirely different screen aside from what was provided to us by Firebase Auth. Don't ask the user when a default will be fine, and this is one of the Android design principles. For example, if you take a look up here, the latitude and longitude refreshes every minute when you're looking for a new plant. I considered having that configurable, but the reality is, would you really need to have that update any more than a minute? If you're taking a picture of a plant, and you take two pictures of two plants, or say a picture of two different plants that are a couple feet away, you know, that GPS location is probably close enough. On the other hand, if the plant is far enough away, it'll take you at least a minute to walk there, so by that time the GPS will refresh. Do I really need to give the user the ability to change that refresh rate from 1 minute? Probably not. Some users may like it, but the complication of having one more setting simply isn't worth it. Next, don't have a separate confirmation screen. Use a toast, a snack bar, and or change color. This is a nice, subtle way to tell the user that something has happened successfully without actually requiring another click. So one thing that I do on this is when I save an item, it refreshes and goes to a new item, and then you know it's saved, and then you can also verify that it's been saved by going up to the spinner up at the top and looking for the plant that you have just saved. One thing I did in another app, one that predates this one, I wrote an app a while back where you could just GPS plants and photograph them, a little simpler than the one you're looking at now. And I found that I would go to a botanical garden and very quickly GPS one plant and go to the next. And I wasn't always looking at my screen, and also the sun was out sometimes, and so I couldn't really see my screen all the time. So I simply had it change color. And I'll probably do the same on this app. So the background color was kind of this brownish color when it was new. And then once it's saved, it changed to a light green color to indicate to save it happened. And then once again, when I would start typing something, it would change back to brown. This is very effective, but with one major footnote. Remember accessibility. Not everybody is going to be able to see colors, and not everybody's going to be able to see the colors the way that you see colors. So if you're using color as an indication, give a secondary indication as well. Something like a vibration for people who are visually challenged, and vice versa. For people who can see but maybe can't feel vibration, the color's helpful. So have a backup, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a different screen. A couple other things that we can do to simplify screens. One is just minimize the components on the screen. If you take a look at the screen, you notice there is no button here that says add a new plant. And remember that we have a focus change listener that handles that. So I can look for my Fuji apple now, or I could change, and see if I click away, okay, we're all good. I could change this to a Honeycrisp. And as you saw just a moment ago, just by noticing it's a plant that's not recognized, it automatically takes that action of prompting to create a new plant. Fill out details, save, and there we go. One other big design principle that's an Android design principle is only show what can be used or is needed at that time. So one good example is you can't delete a specimen that has not been created yet. And I haven't wired this up yet, but when it's on the new specimen selection, I want to remove this delete button until there's something that's saved and can be deleted. On a similar note, think about the apps that you use and ask yourself, how often do you see a save button that you have to click? Not really as much now as you used to. You used to see save buttons a lot in the 90s and in the early 2000s, but now autosave is a lot more common. And that's another thing I'm thinking about for this app, is just remove the save button altogether and simply have it autosave every time the user taps away from a field or a field loses focus. That'll simplify the user interface quite a bit. The only trick is, for this particular app, I have a few things trigger when you hit save, like log on if you haven't logged on already. So notice again, there's no log on button. Aside from this one up here, it will prompt for log on automatically once needed. And that's an important concept. Don't force your users to log on until needed. Because if a user says, I have to sign up just to try things out, I don't want to give away my information, and they're likely to give you a not good review on the Play Store. So let the users play around with your app as much as they want. But once they want to save, once they want to add a comment, once they want to sync to the cloud, anything that requires a credential, then automatically log them on, and only then. Next, use broadcast receiver instead of prompting the user to do some heavy lifting operations. I mentioned an older app I had that was just called plantplaces.com mobile. And I used this quite a bit to GPS plants in botanical gardens, but I was typically out of the country at the time, and this was about 5 years ago, even 7 years ago, before Wi-Fi was very prevalent, and when I was traveling internationally and roaming rates were very expensive. So a lot of times I could get up to 400 pictures in one day, and I certainly didn't want to upload them while I was roaming. So I would go back to my hotel, wherever I was staying, get on their Wi-Fi, and then hit upload. But then I thought about broadcast receivers, and I thought, wait a minute. The phone knows when it's on Wi-Fi. The phone knows when it's plugged in and charging. Our app can get notifications of when it's on Wi-Fi and when the phone is plugged in and charging. I don't need to tell it that. So why don't I just create a broadcast receiver, which is something that can listen for different environmental events like plugged in charging Wi-Fi or connected to Bluetooth, low power, or one of many, many other things. And I'll just say, when the environment is right, then have it synchronize these photos. And it worked great. All I had to do was plug in my phone, log on to Wi-Fi, and I knew the photos were getting synced, and it decluttered my app significantly. Another big Android guideline: pictures are faster than words. People recognize pictures very quickly, especially ones that have come to mean common things. You see, we have the home logo, the map logo, the delete, the pause, and several other items like that. People know what these are, and they take up less space for one. So you see, I'm able to fit more on the screen without it looking very cluttered. For two, and this is a big one, you don't need to translate a picture in most cases. If you write an app and you have a lot of words on it, in whatever language you primarily speak, you will need to translate those words for every other language that you want to support. On the other hand, if you use pictures that are easy to identify, it's easy for others to pick up your application and understand it, even if they don't speak the language. This was funny for me growing up in the United States, where for most of my life everything was English and I never thought anything about it. Then I went to work in France, and I don't speak French. And I got in a rental car down in southeast France, and I remember driving, and the symbols that I saw on the roadways are what really saved me as I was trying to navigate my way around France. I couldn't read a darn thing, but I knew what the common symbols were, and it really helped me to get where I was going. Put yourself in that position. Think about you in another country where you don't speak the language and what you would use to help to navigate. Now, a few things that we want to avoid, and again, these are part of the Android design guidelines. Avoid a splash screen. Those were big years ago, and some people would use a splash screen to load things in the background. Other people would use a splash screen just to look cool. Don't do either of those, because the reality is, with modern coroutines in Kotlin, which essentially are threads, you can have a background process run and update data while the user is using your app. I mentioned this plant entry right here, and I mentioned that it came from a JSON data source. What happens is when you log into this application, it checks on a local database called a room database to see if the plant definitions exist. And if they do, it populates that autocomplete from those plant definitions. And that's the preferred method. It's actually an iOS user guideline that says that any autocomplete should be filled with local data, not remote data. But there's a little trick here, is that At least to my knowledge, there's no way to preload a database with data in an Android app. It has to be loaded once the user starts the app. So, after it checks to see if there's already data, it will go out to the JSON data source, download those plants, and then insert them into the local database for the next time around. And it is about 6,000 plants, so it's a couple seconds, but it is a bit more than milliseconds, so it's a noticeable delay. But the reality is, by the time the user gets to this app for the first time, they're going to start looking at the app for a few seconds, and while they're looking at the app, that's when it's going to update those plant definitions. And because I'm using model view view model design pattern, it's able to essentially observe those plant definitions, know when they change, and then update the autocomplete automatically when they change, even when the user is on the same screen. The user doesn't have to do anything. It all happens in the background. Next, avoid a main menu. And this one might sound surprising early on, and I'll confess that the first app I wrote, I had a big main menu, but avoid a main menu. Number one, it's one extra click to get to where you want to go. The Android design guidelines say the first screen that the user sees should be the screen that they want to get to at least 80% of the time, or the screen that at least 80% of your users are interested in. They want to get in and they want to get to the action. The issue with the main menu is not just that it's an extra click, but also that it puts everything at the same priority. And you really need to think about that. Is create an account the same priority as enter a new specimen? Is edit your settings the same priority as enter a new specimen? So really think about what the user wants to see and prioritize that. Anything that's a lower priority, put it on one of these ellipsis drop-downs, something like that. Just hide it a little bit and don't make it so obvious. The trick is a main menu makes everything obvious. Logon, we talked about this one earlier. Don't write a login screen. You'll spend all your time working on that, and that takes away from your core competency. Integrating something like Firebase Auth is very straightforward to do. I won't cover how to do it in this video, but if you look at my YouTube channel or any of my video channels, you'll see that I've done several videos that show how to do that. Finally, we mentioned separate search and search results. A couple other things we want to think about is simplifying. This is something where you really kind of have to look at the screen, kind of like one of those optical illusions where you keep staring at it until you see the illusion. You want to stare at your screen and decide, am I making the best use of every single pixel here? Can I accomplish the same task another way? Let me show you one thing. I wanted to have a date when I started a specimen. Well, a calendar view is pretty big, isn't it? So I could just have a little calendar widget here that would pop up a calendar view. But you see, I kind of killed two birds with one stone. This is actually a button. And you see a date right here. I can click on this and what happens? A calendar view comes up. I select the button. I choose OK. And then you see that the button updates with the latest date. So if that's the date I want, I don't even need to go into that flow. But if I look at this date and I say that's not the correct date, then I simply press here, and then, and only then, do I get this calendar flow. Show the user what the user wants, only when it's relevant. Now, along with every pixel is expensive, also every click is expensive. So we like things like autocompletes. If we take a look at this, you see we can do a lot on this one screen. I have my plant associated with a specimen, but we know we can also have events. I can take a picture directly from the screen if I wish, and it will automatically create a photo and event and then put it all together nicely on that page. But on a similar note, maybe I need something that is a bit more complicated than this photo and this event, and in that case I'm going to go here to this little button, which is an event screen, where I can give a few more details, like maybe I want to water my plant with 1 gallon, and I can do things like put in the date that it occurred, and even more importantly, I can put in a reminder, remember to water my plant, and add to calendar. It's another good idea. You don't want to duplicate something that already exists on the user's phone, like a calendar. So this is actually going to add it to the Google Calendar that's on the phone. I can also make it recurring like so. So you see, this is a principle that we call progressive disclosure. I didn't have that on the slide, but I think it's worth mentioning. I only see more complications when I want to. By default, this reminder screen is going to give me 3 options. Do I want to add a reminder, like a notification? So I could say water my apple tree, and that will appear on the notifications up above here. Add to calendar. Okay, that's just in the background. Going to add that to the calendar view. And then notice that it looks really simple until I get to a really complicated concept, which is recurrence. A lot harder than it sounds off the top, because you notice I could do a recurrence on a day, week, month, or year. Year might be prune, which is something you tend to do in the early spring in March. So we'd make that an annual event. But watering could be weekly. And then maybe harvesting could be daily for something like a tomato plant. But it gets a little tricky because you might say, well, weekly, but on Mondays. Okay, and we're going to do it until maybe 2022, January 9th. So you see that as the user wishes to get more complicated, you can use these dials to make it a more complicated look and feel. But if the user prefers simple, you simply don't touch the dials. Once again, you notice here we're integrating with the Google Calendar. So it takes all the information I put in, water my apple tree, repeats weekly until January of 2022, and save. And then after that, it takes us right back to our application. With all of that, let's compare and contrast. Look at our simplified storyboard. I don't have the map screen on here, and there's one other screen I didn't show, which is the reminder screen, which simply shows all of the reminders. Once again, it uses the same principles we mentioned before. We have the ability to edit directly on this view. You notice there are several reminders here. It's not just one. You can see about 6 or 7 on this very screen right here. We can toggle the reminders on and off right here without going to another screen. We can even delete the reminder, and once again, we get a pop-up. I delete it, and it's gone. Easy as that. No need to get to another screen. So it's actually about 4 screens. But really, for the basic job of showing the relationship of plant to specimen to event to photo, it only takes 1 or 2 screens, where in the old day, we might have a different screen for add a plant versus see a plant versus delete a plant. Now we can consolidate that by using a little bit of programming magic to help the user and think automatically. That's a whole lot better than this complicated flow that we have here. As always, I hope this video was helpful. Bill Nye the Science Guy says, everybody I meet knows something I don't. So I'm curious, what kind of tricks and techniques do you use to make a simple application? And even looking at the application that I've just demonstrated, can you think of anything that I could have done to make it simpler or less complicated for the user? I can't wait to see your comments. Thank you.